Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 232, 1861, a high-level overview. Last week, we had a brief rundown of three of our main figures for the Confederacy in the sub-theater of the war, the West, if you will. Braxton Bragg being one of those, Joseph E. Johnson and his brief tenure during the first part of the Atlanta campaign, and then John Bell Hood, who takes over, finishes out the Atlanta campaign, and then, of course, has his foray into Tennessee that does not go particularly well. I think that there are plenty of sources that you can look and you can see individuals that have the opinion that this is where, in particular, the war is lost. And it is kind of interesting. I have put together a couple of resources recently where we're talking about James Longstreet and how there is this Western Bloc thought, right? And in some ways, they're kind of right. If the sub-theater had been maybe paid to a little bit more in terms of the attention of the Confederacy, in terms of resources, then maybe things would have been a little bit different. And is it really necessarily the fault of these guys who are at the helm? Are these the right guys? I think maybe you could make some arguments for maybe two out of the three of them. Hopefully you can form your own opinion as to who those are that I'm talking about, right? But certainly it is worth a look, and maybe certainly we can take a look in the future again at the sub-theater and the Army of Tennessee. So this week we're going to do something a little bit different. We haven't done one of these yet, so I don't necessarily know how it's going to go. So hopefully everyone finds this interesting. I figured since we did a week-by-week look in our main narrative episodes and went into detail on some of the events, I thought that perhaps it would be useful to go over in one episode, just go over events for an entire year. Now you could take a look at this and say, Tim, we already did all this stuff. We already talked about this. But I think it's also a worthwhile activity because when the narrative episodes, I tried to do a good job of tying things together, especially when it came to campaigns. And when you started a campaign and maybe you had a skirmish or a battle at the very beginning or kicked off the campaign to kind of introduce it, and then you had some sort of movements, or maybe you skipped a couple of weeks and then you got back into it. So the overall view of things and how the different wheels were shifting and how that affected other areas might have been a little bit lost. And I think I did a pretty decent job, hopefully, of trying to piece everything together and explain why certain things were affecting other theaters, or kind of having the whole picture make sense. So I think it's a worthwhile thought process to then kind of take a look back. Because in some of these new episodes here in this season 2 that we are doing, I definitely want to take a more zoomed in view, right? I want to take pieces of these battles, of these events, and I really want to hone in on them, right? We've done that in a few of these redo episodes. There's a couple of instances where we will be doing certain pieces, like the wheat field coming up here in July. We have that scheduled. We've done Burnside's Bridge, so we've taken pieces that we've already done and really kind of put in more detail into them to definitely have more insight. And now I definitely want to have a higher level view to take a step back, and I think that is also worthwhile. So those two exercises are on my mind here, and certainly 1861 seems like a good place to start here. Why not, right? And I just want to have a little note here as we kick off our timeline and just kind of talk through some of these events, and again, how they connect to other events that down the line that we're going to talk about. But I just want to kind of have a note here that this is actually going to just start from January of 1861. And a lot of this is actually pulled from my timeline that I created. And when I, had a schedule in mind, and I was like, hey, let's have these events. And there's a little bit more finagling that you have to do just to kind of give you a little bit of insight into how the sausage is made, really, with the podcast and how my thought process worked. And then, you take this particular event, and then if I pair it with this, and then I can get a whole episode of that, or how much time can we talk about that? I could talk about a lot of these things a lot longer than maybe I did in the narrative episodes, as I've probably have displayed here in this season 2, but you get the idea. So we will have a rundown starting in January of 1861, and we will go from there. So in January of 1861, you have a lot of the preparation stages, if you will, for getting into the conflict. There are a lot of the adoptions of ordinance of secession for different southern states. We talked about this in the main narrative episode, especially because prior to when we really began our episodes, and we kind of started a little bit prior, I think, to the actual firing on Fort Sumter. So we had already had a couple of states, especially in the Deep South, begin their secession, especially after Abraham Lincoln was elected. And then as we progressed really into the narrative proper, we would have these upper South states that would just kind of pop up with their ordinances of secession. But in January, you have a couple, right? You do have Florida, Alabama, amongst others, right? Mississippi is also going to discuss it. They're going to begin their discussing of it, and then they're also going to secede on the 9th, right? But at the same time, as you have these ordinances of secession, you have some movements in terms of action, right? In the beginning of the month on January 2nd, you have your South Carolina state troops seizing Fort Johnson in Charleston Harbor. Now, the reason why that is actually important, we've talked before about how South Carolina seemingly is always ready for kind of this rebellion. They already have that kind of reputation that's going to surround them. You know, you had your conflict with Calhoun and Andrew Jackson, and your tariff issues that you're going to run into, and how there is always this question, and we've kind of talked about that as well, especially in some of these wrap-up episodes that we did when it came to the end of the war and Reconstruction, and why does the war even start in the first place. But I think that there is also kind of the way I want to describe it, the way that I have been explaining it when asked about it recently, is that there is definitely an umbrella, and not just because it's raining outside right now when I'm recording this, but there's definitely an umbrella, and on the handle of the umbrella, if you will, you have the issue of slavery, and in the actual umbrella part, you have all these other kind of issues, whether that's going to be your economic disparity, whether that's going to be your question of what is statehood within the United States, right? You can't really have one without the other, because, you know, it's an umbrella doesn't work, right? In the rain, if you just have the handle part, and it doesn't actually work very well if you just have the fabric umbrella part, let's say, you know, you can't really have one without the other. It's not going to work very well. So that's the way I've been describing it. But certainly you can really have this argument of, if I am dissatisfied with this union, you know, and I'm a state and I'm South Carolina, why can't I leave? Why can't I decide, hey, I don't want to be part of this anymore? And that's where we have this conflict that goes back to the generation of this United States, right? Of, is the federal government going to be able to step in and say, no, you can't leave? Or am I going to be able to act as my own sovereign kind of entity, and I'm going to be able to then kind of forge my own path moving forward? So that's where we kind of have this argument, even from the outset. The first event that we have here in 1861, South Carolina is ready to start that. The Star of the West is going to fail to relieve Fort Sumter on January 9th. And that's actually kind of significant, and I actually kind of learned something here. I kind of knew the timeline, and in one of these episodes that we're actually going to be doing here on the schedule next year, I want to actually hash out again kind of these early stages of the conflict, of the beginning of the war, because I think it is kind of interesting to see just how it kind of rolls out here in the beginning with Fort Sumter, and then, you know, Lincoln and his election. I think we can go back and kind of redo that, on the theme of redoing these episodes. I believe we can go ahead and scheduled that for the future. But the Star of the West is supposed to get in there and resupply Fort Sumter, and they are not going to be able to do that. And this is January that this happens. And I kind of forgot about this, where when I was talking about kind of the timeline of Fort Sumter and how the Star of the West it is dispatched, and it's one of these relief efforts, one of the kind of famous relief efforts, and they're not going to be successful. And you kind of make it seem like maybe because the war starts in April that this is going to be, maybe March or early April, let's say, that this happens, and it's actually in January. So it's actually quite some time before the actual firing on Fort Sumter. So it is actually, again, as I mentioned at the top of the episode, a worthwhile exercise to kind of look at it from a very elevated state here on the year as a whole. So at the same time that we're having these ordinances of secession, and at the same time that we're having this kind of startings of rumblings of movement by your state troops, you're also going to have these forays into potential compromise. So we do have actually here in the beginning of the year, January 16th, the Crittenden Compromise that's going to die in the U.S. Senate. And you're going to see some of these efforts, right? Famously, we had John Tyler, who's also going to try to get together with some of these delegates. Let's try to figure this out. Certainly, there's a way that we can figure it out without war, and they're just not going to be able to do that. So there are these efforts, even after Lincoln is elected, where we're trying to figure it out, and we're just not able to come to the table. And to be fair, there is probably some unwillingness of certain delegates to actually come to the table and have an actual agreement at that point, because things have just boiled up just so much. February 4th, we're going to see the delegates from the states that have already seceded meeting to establish the Confederate government, and you are going to see some rapid fire on February 8th. A convention of these states, they're going to adopt a provisional constitution. Then we've talked about this constitution very briefly in some of these episodes, the narrative episodes, and that is actually kind of funny. It's very similar to the Constitution that is the United States Constitution, except, of course, slavery is going to be legal. So it's really going to be some hard work, I guess, if you will, by these individuals. We're just going to take the same thing because we agree with all this other stuff, except we're going to change one thing, right? And Jefferson Davis on February 9th is going to be elected the Provisional Confederate President. And eventually he'll take that provisional off his title, and we know he'll be the president throughout the war for the Confederacy. Now, there were some other choices for Confederate president. We've talked about that before, and how Jefferson Davis, he's kind of this interesting figure, right? You can maybe make the comparison that on his resume, it's similar, I guess you could say, to George Washington, right? You could say he has this experience in war. He's been in government. He's been the Secretary of War. He was in the war with Mexico. He commanded troops in the field, right? Why not make this guy, who is seemingly this compromise candidate from all across the board, because he wasn't necessarily gung-ho in terms of being this fire eater either, but he also wasn't necessarily a peace Democrat rolling into it. So he is seemingly a good choice for president for the Confederacy. You're going to have a couple of these instances where there is going to be the seizing of U.S. arsenals. It's very actually important. Prior to Abraham Lincoln's election, February 16th, you have Texas state troops that's going to seize the U.S. arsenal in San Antonio. Already in January, you had similar instances in Alabama, and you have Louisiana doing the same thing. And this is where you get the arguments that maybe James Buchanan was not a very good president, and that's why he ends up on the worst president list, because he doesn't do anything about any of this stuff. And there's no real direction for any of the federal troops that are posted anywhere. So they kind of just leave and let these individuals take these things. Now, there are certain instances where they're not going to allow certain pieces of ordnance to fall into enemy hands. But I think the main point is, if you had had a heavier hand, if it had been, say, Andrew Jackson, if he was still the president, right? Even if he was on his way out, you have to think that Andrew Jackson would have done something about this, right? So in some ways, it is kind of like in one of my favorite history podcasts that I very much encourage you to listen to. It's the Revolutions podcast by Mike Duncan. He mentions how in some of these instances with these revolutions, you have these leaders who are just not the right guy for the job. Maybe they would have been a great king prior to the time of revolution. And certainly I think Buchanan might have been a great president prior to this crisis, but he's just the wrong guy in the wrong place at the wrong time. In February, you're also going to get Abraham Lincoln, who's going to arrive into Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. And we know that that was kind of a close run thing. There are challenges in him getting there in the first place. And he's officially going to become the 16th president of the United States on March 4th, 1861. But in the meantime, March is really kind of this recharge moment, if you will, where the United States and Lincoln and his cabinet is going to try to figure out what to do. And it's not until you see April 11th, famously, you have the Confederates who are going to finally demand Fort Sumter surrender, right? And then they're going to start to bombard the fort, famously. Very gentlemanly note that we're going to start the bombardment. 12th, they're going to do that. And then April 13th, Fort Sumter is going to surrender not because there's any kind of effectual fire, just because you're running low on supplies. There are a lot of guns that are pointed at you. They are firing. They're not really doing anything, but they are firing on you. And then you're going to surrender. The war is going to be on. April 17th, and I think there is going to be an importance in this, a significance of this in terms of the war, and not just because this is the state that I'm from, but Virginia is going to adopt their ordinance of secession and schedule their referendum for May. Virginia, if they do not secede from the Union, then the war is very different. And that is my opinion, that Virginia is really going to make the war continue because of the manpower, because of the resources, because that's where the capital is going to be, right? Because of the generals that it brings to the table as well. For all those reasons, I think it kind of perpetuates the war a little longer than maybe otherwise it would have been. April 19th, you're going to see the street riots in Baltimore. Remember, you're going to have these militias and volunteer units that are going to be moving in to the Capitol. And one of the things that we tried to highlight, I think, in our narrative episodes, that is a huge problem for Abraham Lincoln, is that Washington, D.C. not only is surrounded by those southern supporting areas in Maryland and Virginia, but it's also kind of a southern supporting area in its own right. So the objectives are very clear in this early onset. We need to solidify our position here in the capital. Cannot evacuate the capital for a variety of reasons. We've talked about that before. Abraham Lincoln is always very much afraid that there's going to be an attempt on Washington, D.C. That's why there's a huge ring of fortifications that eventually pops up around the city. And if it were to fall, it would give legitimacy to these rebels, especially in the eyes of these foreign powers who could, if not join the war, they could certainly step in and try to intercede to force a conclusion to the war. Abraham Lincoln cannot afford that, so that's why Washington, D.C. is very important. On April 22nd, you have Robert E. Lee, who is going to accept command of Virginia forces. Even in this early outset of the war, we talked about that when we went over our redo episode of First Manassas. Robert E. Lee is going to have his handprint on how things are proceeding. He's going to do a good job of getting these regiments that are being sent in from these states abroad, and he's going to funnel them in. And without Robert E. Lee's efforts, there is not going to be as large of an army. I do not believe that is going to be able to face Irvin McDowell. And really, First Manassas, both sides need all hands on deck for that battle. So it is very important that they get every man into the field. May 3rd, 1861, Lincoln's going to call for volunteers to join the Union Army. He needs 3-year terms of enlistment. Hopefully it doesn't last that long, right? But 3 years, we need to be able to serve for that long, right? This war is going to be fought by volunteers. There's not enough U.S. regular forces. It's probably hard to believe in this modern day, but there was not a very large regular army prior to the outbreak of the war. So we need to make sure that these militia units that we had that are really serving as the backbone of any kind of military forces that we would have had prior to the Civil War, we need to make sure that these volunteer units are being created into a cohesive force. May 6th, you're going to see Arkansas and Tennessee adopt their ordinances of secession. May 13th, you're going to see U.S. troops occupy Baltimore. North Carolina adopting an ordinance of secession on May 20th, with Kentucky declaring its neutrality on the same day. Now, it's very important. We talked about this in the narrative episodes. Kentucky wants to be neutral, and they do not want to participate in the conflict. There are individuals on both sides, sometimes even in the same family, who are wanting to have the state go pro-Confederacy or pro-Union, depending on how they lean. So keep that in mind. Keep that in the back of the brain here. May 21st, 1861, you're going to see the Confederate capital move to Richmond, Virginia, right? Again, displaying the importance of Virginia as a state as a whole. Richmond becomes a very large city comparatively to what it was before. We have the industrial capacity that, say, Tredegar Iron Works creates. So it's very important to the war effort. May 24th, you're going to see the startings of the campaign, or kind of the movement into Virginia by these federal troops, Irvin McDowell's army, with the seizing of Alexandria, Virginia. It's right across the river from Washington, D.C. And with that, we talked about Elmer Ellsworth and his fire zouaves. He's going to be killed. He goes up to the roof of a hotel and takes down a flag. He's killed by the hotel owner, and he is avenged by his zouaves, but becomes one of the early casualties of the war. Elmer Ellsworth had a personal relationship with Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln takes the death of Ellsworth particularly hard. June 2nd, 1861, you're going to see Beauregard take command of Confederate forces in Northern Virginia. He is the hero of Fort Sumter. Whether or not he deserves to be labeled a hero is debatable, but he's going to be the one who's taking over for the troops in the field. June 8th, you're going to see Tennessee approving the referendum to secede. That's going to be big. Remember, you have East Tennessee, who had already been trying to maybe make themselves into their own state. Tennessee as a whole is going to be seceding from the Union. June 10th, you're going to see action at Big Bethel. Remember, Benjamin Butler is out there on the peninsula. He's going to have kind of this reconnaissance. Not going to be so much a campaign to move up the peninsula as we will see in 1862, but there's going to be a reconnaissance. He's going to run into Daniel Harvey Hill, and there's going to be a brief engagement there. It's going to be considered to be a larger battle, number one, even though there's not really a whole lot of casualties. And number two, it's going to be considered to be kind of a less than honorable fight because the Confederates had breastworks that they had created, and these troops, including some Zouaves, run into the breastworks and they're repulsed. June 17th, you're going to have an engagement at Boonville, Missouri. Remember that we have early action in Missouri. Missouri is going to kind of be the battleground. Yes, you have Virginia with First Manassas. That's where the big battle is going to be fought. But you have Missouri, where there's going to be a lot of back and forth. You have Nathaniel Lyon, who is going to create this army, this force. Remember, St. Louis has a lot of German immigrants. If you recently arrived from Germany, you probably participated in the Revolution of 1848. You're probably moving to America because you're a little more liberal in your thinking. And so you were going to side not with the conservative South, but you're going to side with the Republican Party and the North. And that's where the backbone of this army in Missouri is going to come from. You have Franz Sigel, right? That's going to be a primary subordinate of Lyon and his actions. Early on in the conflict, you're going to see some success for the Union Army. whether that's Boonville, Carthage, right? They're going to be driving the Confederate forces into the southern part of the state. And that is going to be kind of hand in hand, right, with this protection of Missouri. We need to make sure that these border states are well in hand, whether that is Missouri. There are other places where their emphasis is going to be placed upon, including West Virginia. And again, in the early stages of the conflict, West Virginia is also going to be a main battleground. You're going to see Laurel Hill and Rich Mountain, July 7th, July 11th. Those are going to be two very early engagements. With Rich Mountain, you're actually going to see William Stark Rosecrans break onto the stage, although a lot of the credit is actually given to George B. McClellan, who is commanding this Department of Ohio here early on in the war. July 18th, you're going to see Blackburn's Ford. This is going to be the first kind of main engagement, really, skirmish, where Irvin McDowell's army is going to run into Beauregard's army here in his line along Bull Run. Beauregard had withdrawn from Centerville. He had a pretty strong position at Centerville, but he had withdrawn because Irvin McDowell has a pretty large army. He has a large enough army where Beauregard is going to send for Joseph E. Johnson, and his army that's in the valley, Robert Patterson, as we know, is supposed to hold down Johnson, but he's going to fail to do that. And so, even though the railroad probably doesn't play as big of a role in terms of getting Johnson's army there quickly, still going to get him there. And then on July 21st, you're going to see the Battle of First Manassas or First Bull Run. The first battle of the war, or major battle, is going to be a Confederate victory. So Irvin McDowell is going to be sidelined from then on. He is going to be benched in favor of George McClellan on July 27th. So not long after that is when he is going to be cast aside. Irvin McDowell does pop back up in our story. Remember, he's going to be part of John Pope's army, but George McClellan is going to be at the reins for quite some time until his benching as well. So in the latter part of July, the 26th and 27th, you actually have some evacuation of federal forces in New Mexico. Remember, there will be an invasion of New Mexico by Confederate forces. The famous Texas Brigade invades New Mexico. Not the Texas Brigade, I guess, but there will be a Texan invasion. And there is actually kind of this infiltration attempt by pro-Confederate forces into this area. There's kind of this dream that not only New Mexico comes into the fold, you have pro-Confederate Arizona in the southern part there of Arizona, and then you're able to get out to California, and eventually you're going to have a Pacific port for the Confederacy. And that is an interesting concept. Logistically, probably not going to be able to do that, but still, again, interesting concept nonetheless. August 10th, you have the Battle of Wilson's Creek, Missouri. Remember, we had Nathaniel Lyon, who is going to be kind of getting the upper hand on especially the Missouri State Guard that is being led by Sterling Price, Old Pap. But he's going to be joined by Benjamin McCullough and the Confederate forces that are kind of rallied around these Missouri State troops. And there's going to be kind of a complicated plan by the Union forces, who are also going to be outnumbered. Nathaniel Lyon is going to roll out this plan. He's going to be killed during this engagement. He'll be the first Union general to be killed in action during the war, August 10th, 1861. August 14th, you're going to see the mutiny of the 79th New York in D.C. We talked about this before. 79th New York, those were the Highlanders. There's kind of this dissatisfaction, and I think kind of it highlights the sort of height of the lack of discipline that these early units are going to display, right? Kind of signals the end of this old army and into this new army with discipline that McClellan builds, because he does do a pretty good job of building the army, right? And that's one thing that we can say, where he does have his baby, the Army of the Potomac, if you will, and then he doesn't want anything to happen to his baby, and that's why he doesn't throw as many men into action when he probably should have during his attempts at Richmond. In the early part of the war, I think there is kind of this sense of adventure by your volunteer troops. The reasons for joining up are very different than your volunteer troops as the war progresses. So we kind of have a phasing out of that, a phasing out of this, we're going to elect our own officers, and that's going to be who's going to lead us, and now it's going to be who's qualified to lead us. We're actually going to be formed into an army. That's what this event really signifies. On August 29th, we have the capture of Forts Hatteras and Clark in North Carolina. Remember, we are starting to formulate and execute this Anaconda Plan, even though the Anaconda Plan, it wasn't really actually said that this is what we're doing, but eventually this is what happens, right? Where we are isolating the Confederacy by eliminating their ports that they have, so they cannot have ships going out to get any kind of supply coming in. So this is going to be step one in terms of taking out the ports that are there in North Carolina. And then eventually we'll be trying to blockade New Orleans, Mobile, amongst others, and the elimination of river traffic on the Mississippi, control of the Mississippi. Again, that's also going to be a big objective of the Lincoln administration, which we will see as we progress throughout the war. September 3rd, 1861, we're going to see the Confederate troops enter into Kentucky, thus ending the neutral status of the state. And who is responsible for that? But it is Leonidas Polk, who is going to break the neutrality of Kentucky. He occupies a very nice defensive position at Columbus, which you cannot necessarily knock him for that. However, probably not the best idea to be the one to violate the neutrality. So there, I've actually seen it pointed out in some of the harsher critics for Leonidas Polk that this is really his biggest contribution to the war, is violating Kentucky's neutrality, because other than that, he fails to really do a whole lot on the battlefield to have his name be out there. On September 10th, you have an engagement at Carnifex Ferry. Remember, there is continued action in West Virginia. There are federal troops who are going to be occupying this western part of the state. But you have Confederates who are wanting to make sure that Virginia stays in the fold as a whole. All these western Virginian counties are not going to want to be seceding, so they're going to be pro-Union. Cheat Mountain, you have Robert E. Lee commanding there, and he's not going to do a very good job, and he's going to take the loss, and eventually he'll be sent to the Low Country to help build earthworks there. And you kind of think, at least in this early part of the war, that maybe Robert E. Lee's career could sort of end, and maybe he could end up sort of just being an advisor to Jefferson Davis. September 20th, 1861, Sterling Price is going to capture Lexington, Missouri. The Union garrison surrendering there. This is kind of the high water mark in terms of the Confederate forces operating in Missouri. Remember, there are all these conflicting reports of how many Confederates exactly are in this Missouri State Guard army that's been formulated. And there are reports that there are, quite a lot that would have, probably been exaggerated, but entirely possible that there are enough individuals in Missouri that it actually would have been a fairly large army for the Confederates. And we just talked about this. Braxton Bragg initially actually is getting the tab to maybe come and take over the Confederate forces in this area. And again, just like McClellan, he's actually very much like McClellan in some ways. He's a very good organizer. So if he's able to organize these individuals and make sure that that number is not fluctuating and stays static, how things could have been different, right? And it's another what if that you can throw out there. Speaking of Braxton Bragg, you have an engagement on Santa Rosa Island, Florida on October 9th. Santa Rosa, those troops that are at Pensacola, They are well drilled by Braxton Bragg. They attempt to capture Santa Rosa Island. There is a Union fort there. They are not going to be successful. October 21st, you have the Battle of Balls Bluff, Leesburg. There's going to be faulty intelligence that's going to lead Edward Baker to cross the Potomac River with the brigade. They're going to be ambushed or attacked by Shanks Evans and his Confederates, and it is going to be a disaster because Baker is going to be killed. Baker is also a personal friend of Abraham Lincoln, and there's going to be a pell-mell retreat into the river. There's going to be bodies that float down the river to Washington, and that's going to eventually lead to the creation of the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War, because we're not really satisfied with the way George B. McClellan is running things. Charles Pomeroy Stone is going to be, in my mind, unfairly leveled with the criticism for this attempt here, this Balls Bluff kind of catastrophe, if you will. And so he's going to kind of unfairly be actually imprisoned for a while. And he's kind of the stand-in for McClellan, even as early as this part of the war. Speaking of McClellan, on November 1st, you're going to see George B. replacing Winfield Scott as the General-in-Chief for the U.S. Army. So remember, when the war begins, you have Winfield Scott, who served in the War of 1812, famously commands the army that captures Mexico City in the War with Mexico, declines to command in the field for the early part of the uprising. He's still the commander-in-chief. He comes up with this Anaconda Plan that eventually is sort of the key to success for the Union Army and the Union victory. He's actually going to survive the war as well. Yeah, I pointed this out actually in our narrative episodes. It's kind of surprising, given that he is in poor health. He cannot command in the field because he's not really capable of that anymore. He's a little bit older, but he does survive the war, oddly enough. And he was going to be replaced. He doesn't really get along with George B. McClellan. In some ways, this is not necessarily a positive or negative move. I think you can make the argument that even if McClellan was not who he was, even if there was not frustration with him in terms of whether you're pro or negative, McClellan, should he have started to move prior to this? Should he have been doing something other than building up his army? There's a solid argument to say that the Army of the Potomac really needs this time to become an effective fighting force. Was Winfield Scott wrong in coming up with his Anaconda Plan? Was he wrong in his selection of Irving McDowell? Maybe, right? Certainly, I think even Winfield Scott kind of realizes that he is not going to have the same kind of experience. He's not going to have any kind of experience in commanding as large an army as McClellan is putting together. So it will be McClellan who is going to be fully at the helm. On November 8th, you have the Trent Affair. Remember, there is a British vessel that has Confederate agents on it. The U.S. Navy is going to stop it and then board the vessel. This is about as close as you're going to come to the relations between Great Britain and the United States deteriorating to the point where Great Britain is either going to enter the war or at least provide large material support for the Confederacy. And I know that this is necessarily not something that you really think about a whole lot, but there are actually some brigades that get shifted to Canada, and there is a lot of voices, including Seward, who are in Lincoln's ear that say, hey, we should just go ahead and attack Canada. That was more of a pre-war thought process from him. It's like, if we go ahead and attack Great Britain, then we can solidify the country and unify us, because, what do Americans like better than a good war to put us all together? So, but the Trent Affair, again, you have this instant where if there's material support, things aren't really going well for the Union. 1861, I know we're not necessarily all the way through the year with our events, But 1861, you can definitely chalk that up as a Confederate W. The first major battle, really the first two major battles in terms of First Manassas, Wilson's Creek. Those are Confederate victories. You do have starting of kind of the constricting of the Confederate naval presence, and their ports are starting to be constricted by the U.S. Navy. So that is definitely a victory for the Union. There's not a whole lot of battlefield success, right? Even Big Bethel and Ball's Bluff in Virginia, two smaller engagements. Those are both Confederate victories. And when you have something like the Trent Affair, it's not looking great. So if the British or the French are not going to really act without Great Britain on their side. They don't want to be alone in this endeavor. So if they're joining, then you best believe the French are, and that is not going to be good for the United States. November 21st, you have Judah P. Benjamin, who is going to be confirmed as the Confederate Secretary of War. And Judah P. Benjamin is actually going to hold a variety of different cabinet positions for Jefferson Davis. He's going to be kind of a mainstay. There's going to be a little bit of a revolving door for the Confederate cabinet, but Benjamin is going to be around for pretty much the entirety of the war in different capacities. On December 9th, 1861, you have the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War being established by Congress. Again, remember, you had Ball's Bluff, who's going to spur this. Now we're going to have especially some pretty hardcore Republicans who are going to be sort of reviewing the war effort and maybe even taking some shots at those who are not prosecuting the war to the degree that the government would like them to. To close out December, there's actually going to be a couple of skirmishes in modern-day Oklahoma, the Indian Territory. Remember that is kind of like a civil war in and of itself, where you do have a majority of the individuals there being pro-Confederate, and then you have another faction that is actually going to be pro-Union. Again, we talked about these in the narrative where there are a variety of reasons for that. For one, a lot of these tribes, whether that's Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, they had all been kind of assimilating into the Southern culture prior to the Trail of Tears, and they continue to do so even after they get to the Indian Territory. So a lot of them are actually pro-slavery, and there are also those who have a very deep distrust of the federal government, and that's actually one that we could probably really understand if you had been living in Georgia and then you were forced by the government to move to Oklahoma. Then you probably do have a very big distrust of the government. So you were not going to be on the side of these individuals who are trying to tell others what to do, right? So there is going to be a siding with the Confederacy initially. But again, there's a civil war in of itself, and there's a couple engagements in December that really highlight that. And also it highlights how the war is kind of on the fringes in the beginning, whether that's Missouri, right? There's action in New Mexico, Arizona, right? These smaller scale actions, Oklahoma, naval action on these ports, right? Places that maybe necessarily we don't talk about and don't think about. That's why I think it's worthwhile taking a look at 1861 just as a whole. That will end, though, our high-level overview of the year, and hopefully you found it interesting to kind of take a step back and really go through these events and how they kind of affect each other. And even if it's just, hey, not that you missed this the first time, but hey, First Manassas happens in July, the 21st, the 27th, McClellan takes over, Ball's Bluff happens October 21st. There's nothing that really happens in between. And that's why there is frustration on behalf of the government, especially because they're having to sit with that first loss, right? You see the unraveling kind of the plan, again, on the fringes. Here's what's happening. You have these engagements that are happening in these lesser known theaters of the war, but you also kind of have the unrolling of U.S. Navy is starting to kind of begin their blockade. We're having, unfortunately, this incident where maybe the uncertainty where Great Britain could enter the war as well. So there's a lot of kind of what ifs on the table, and there's a lot of we don't necessarily know how things are going to move forward. And we tried to talk about that in our narrative episodes. That's another thing that I like to highlight, is that, especially at this stage, we don't know how it's going to go. It's not a foregone conclusion, right? There are certainly situations where there are greater odds that the kind of the underdog, if you will, in terms of the Confederacy overcomes. And if you're getting a big backer, that could make things very different. So we have that benefit of knowing exactly how things turn out. But if you are Abraham Lincoln and you take a look at the year, then you can definitely understand why there's some uneasiness. And there is that kind of uncertainty as we move into 1862. So that's going to wrap it up for 1861. Next week, we're actually going to do another redo episode. And this one is actually going to be a smaller scale engagement. We talked about Charleston here in our 1861 episode, high level, obviously. Well, we're going to be going back to Charleston next time. We're going to be talking once again about the Battle of Secessionville. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Post it in the description. Should be a link to the Patreon as well as website. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.